Hello, everyone. Can we settle down? I welcome all of you to the post-lunch session on post-lunch session on the articulations of the questions of difference. I am Rohit Muzumdar. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Environment and Architecture. As we were discussing in our faculty meetings about whom do we invite for this session, Anooradha's name instantaneously came up for a number of people within our faculty room. We as a school are very kind of serious about articulating inquiries around questions of difference. And Anooradha has not only been a friend, well-wisher, but also a supporter, and has engaged with us in several conversations through her own work. And her work around Dada refugee camp in northeastern Kenya, finds resonances with some of the turbulent events that seem to be happening at this moment in time in India, revolving around questions of citizenship and the nation state. So she has been one of her work kind of opens out an area of inquiry that directly connects to this condition that we are situated in at this moment. I'm also personally drawn to her work because I'm myself inquiring into the transformation of a refugee camp into a vibrant industrial cluster on the outskirts of Mumbai, which runs on small-scale industries based on economies of copy culture. These were partition refugees who migrated from Pakistan, Sindh, Pakistan, and settled down in 47 in Ulhasnagar on the outskirts of Mumbai. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here, Anooradha. Just give you a big brief background. Anooradha Iyer Siddiqi is a faculty member at the Barnard College, Columbia University. Through her work on Dadaab refugee camps, she examines the intellectual histories of architecture, craft, settlement, and experiences of migration and territorial partition. Her other work has revolved around looking at the work or kind of examining the work of Minette De Silva, which engages with the intellectual and heritage work of one of the first women architects to establish a professional architectural practice and is an important cultural figure in the history of Ceylon, Sri Lanka. With this, I'll hand over the platform to Anooradha. Welcome once again. Look forward to this conversation and many more with you.
Okay, I made it up the steps without tripping on my sari, so that's already an achievement. Got it? So thanks so much, Rohit, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone at SEA for your attentiveness and for convening. It's really a privilege to be here to celebrate your graduation. Okay, so I'm just, I've been asked to come and help think about articulations on the question of difference. So, and all of this is an exercise in thinking with turbulence. So to do this, I would like to ask that we imagine a condition that describes the very essence of turbulence, the violation of home. Whether imagined at the scale of the dwelling or the state, disturbance to the tranquility of the domestic produces crisis. With this, I propose a radical understanding of domesticity, one with intimacies and interiors of both house and land, and one that eschews the flattening politics of housing, as well as the apolitical bare life of shelter. I think some of the students began to speak about this yesterday. Emergency domesticity, or emergency homemaking, which is what I'll try to focus on today, may utter a great deal about architecture and architects. I propose that emergency is neither exceptional nor even out of the ordinary, but instead it serves as a method, the basis for an epistemology and pedagogy of everyday life. My proposal begins with a study in the making and inhabiting of a refugee camp. It stems from these many years of research in East Africa in the massive refugee settlements at Dadaab. These camps were established in 1991 near the Kenyan border with Somalia. And they were established after the breakdown of Somalia's civil government. And this was an emergency that has not yet abated. The Dadaab camps have been informative equally in revealing the political implications and limitations of architecture, and also in illuminating histories of land and partition that lie behind the current territorialities there and also elsewhere. I think they have something to say about here as well. Between 2007 and 2011, Shamso Abdullahi Farah, who's here on the screen, she's a refugee from Bulahau, Somalia, performed work that was integral to an international governmental initiative in these UNHCR-administered camps. She lived in Ifo, which is the first humanitarian settlement in Dadaab. And her narration of her events and experiences as a homemaker and homemaking in an emergency context of building a shelter and in the process becoming a kind of technical expert and social organizer while also housing her growing family. She's pregnant in this picture. I believe offer ways to think about shelter and the right to it, whether these are indeed inalienable from the nation state, and precisely how they exert state and non-governmental dynamics. Her experiences suggest the limit concept for the existence of the refugee camp wasn't necessarily the nation state or its territory or its borders, but indeed much more materially the land, and especially people's uses, negotiations, and transgressions of land. Farah's work as a builder destabilized the meaning of the architect. And we think of an architect as a figure legitimated exclusively by the state. And instead, I think that her work points to forms of authority that architecture calls upon. She's, in a sense, building and inhabiting the minimum dwelling par excellence. And her work, I believe, lives at the intersection of histories of design, planning, economic growth, political growth, development, humanitarian ideology, as well as contestations of land. So to understand Farah's story, I thought it might, in honor of being here in Bombay, not so far from the mill area, I thought it might be interesting to think briefly with questions that Friedrich Engels brought up in articles that he wrote in 1872 and 1873, gathered under a collection called The Housing Question. These were articles that addressed a contemporary housing shortage, or what Engels called the so-called housing shortage. He argued that it was a constructed shortage, a constructed condition, while he was also critiquing those who had the aspirations of fixing it. His first criticism was of the rent-to-ownership scheme that had been proposed by some utopian socialists, particularly Proudhon. He thought that Proudhon was responding to the housing crisis by taking refuge in abstractions of law over concrete economic realities. But his second criticism was of the bourgeoisie, and he felt that the bourgeoisie was taking refuge in charitable philanthropy, also an abstraction, basically looking to morality rather than economic realities. For Engels, both law and philanthropy worked against revolution. Both segregated people within the built environment. So I'll ask you to keep Farah's image in mind as you think about that. So each of these critiques, as well as the kind of the condition of segregating populations in a built environment, the way that they would have been done, the kinds of things that Engels would have been reacting to in the late 19th century had to do with hygienic separations of populations, which I think, if you know the history of Bombay, you know that that happened here as well. Each of these critiques might be understood very well in Dadaab, where someone like Shamso Abdullahi Farah was laboring to develop a shelter initiative, and she did that in conjunction with an NGO known as the Norwegian Refugee Council. just for some background, in Kenya, refugees are denied the legal rights to work and pursue education. They're regularly policed. They're not free to move outside of designated camps. And over decades, they've been rendered structurally dependent upon aid. And following the arguments that Engels was laying out, the organizations contracted by the UNHCR to see to their shelter and their care engaged in two relevant practices in managing displacement. First, they took a certain refuge from politics, particularly provided in the letter of international law, to justify making camps rather than making lives. Second, standing in for Engels's bourgeoisie, you have these charitable philanthropies that are operating within a realm of emergency and co-constructing a structural framework of the moral. They're privileging morality over the actual real lived conditions. Such a framework elides history and politics, and instead produces interests, effects, affect, which all supplant possibility for political change. And in emergencies, these two practices, retreating from the political and fashioning the moral at the same time, condition the subjecthood of refugees. So some of what I want to think about today in this thinking about articulations of difference is something about subjecthood and how it's created. Now, in the milieu in which Engels was thinking of these two practices, as well as in Dadaab, we see two different projects at play. The first was a social project, and the second is a humanitarian project. And I'm put on the screen a quote by Miriam Tickton, who argues that humanitarianism is characterized by a tension between a focus on the exceptional individual and a collective humanity, whereas the social project really is about a social world. The humanitarian is much more about a group of individuals. The individual is understood as the unit of there isn't a society in that sense. Humanitarianism, she says, is practiced on humanity conceived of as a set of singular individuals facing exceptional circumstances. So thus, refugees are figured as a kind of blur of humanity, which Lisa Malky has written about. This renders them as a body of individuals rather than a social body, a body of political sovereigns rather than a body politic. This distinction, I think, also came up in many of the projects we saw yesterday. This distinction matters when one of the individuals takes a sovereign action, makes an intervention, or begins to make a world. And this is where I think Farah's story comes in. So Shamsa Abdullahi Farah arrived to Kenya with her extended family 12 years after the establishment of Ifo camp, that first camp at Dadaab, where she ended up living. The government of Kenya and the UNHCR had established the settlements to respond to civil war, drought, famine, this sort of set of complex, multiple emergencies that had displaced approximately 1.7 million people in Somalia in 1991. This is a little developed region, but it sits on top of a Jurassic era aquifer. And this has allowed this region to support the growth and development of these camps over this prolonged period of time. They have since grown to accommodate approximately 500,000 refugees and migrants. It was known in the popular press as the world's largest refugee camp until last year during the Rohingya crisis. Within Farah's first 3 years in Ifo, the emergency was so acute that shelter aid was as urgent as food and water distribution. However, refugees in Ifo sorely mistrusted the motives and competence of shelter aid programs. This organization, CARE, which is a big World War II development aid organization, had managed the camps, all the camps in Kenya, and particularly in Dadaab. almost since their establishment. And they had been constructing shelters that proved deadly after heavy winds blew the roofs off of several structures. So the UNHCR initiated several programs. In Geneva, they had a program to try to think through developing prototypes for shelters. They contracted the Norwegian Refugee Council to apply its expertise in shelter aid. So the Norwegian Refugee Council at the time and since had integrated into its staff a variety of specialists who specialized in spatial operations, many people who were actually trained as architects themselves. And from 2006, when it started work in Kenya, it employed several project managers who had been trained in architecture or construction. Many held degrees from European architecture schools. And in the Dadaab settlements, it built something like 3,000 shelters in 2007 and 3,500 2 years later. And each of these was, in the aid industry, is considered a high volume of production. The Norwegian Refugee Council's approaches to shelter valued the architectural discipline's concerns: attention to design details, the craft of building, and a rational process of construction. The organization produced a carefully detailed, well-made, high-value, and high-cost object that you see on the screen. The design and construction methods very successfully accounted for Dadaab's extreme environmental factors. It used squared, wire-cut, kiln-fired bricks, cement-stabilized soil blocks under a mud plaster protective exterior. This is a technology that offered possibilities for prefabrication and mass fabrication. And the technology also surpassed both the technical and the aesthetic standards elsewhere in the refugee settlements and also elsewhere in the surrounding towns. So you can imagine this exacerbated relationships between the refugees and the host community. Humanitarian engineers designed the structural foundations with care for durability and longevity, and to combat flooding, to secure the vertical structure for roof support. This is a durable, well-crafted architecture that was then intended to work doubly it was intended to perform the function of organizing and mobilizing refugee communities through training in the construction of shelters. According to the staff in Dadaab, the Norwegian Refugee Council approached craft and subsequently labor for shelters with the intention of establishing a sense of refugee ownership, of refugee empowerment, by instituting livelihoods, training, and skills building, as well as the kind of physical protection that a shelter offers, all as quote-unquote derivatives of the aid package. So these are part of a long lineage of quote-unquote participatory practices. These grew out of self-help development models in the 1960s and 1970s. By that time, they had been thoroughly adopted in international humanitarian networks. But of course, in IFO camp, participation was negotiated within a space in which residents were not citizens, land users could not legally own property, and the state denied refugees the right to labor for compensation. And moreover, the object at the end of this homemaking labor was at once inherent to the territory of the Kenyan state, the culture of Somali and other pastoralist communities of the Kenyan Northeast, the political space of the international order, and the social world of refugees and the stateless. And at the same time, it made a very strange, latent visual representation of the Norwegian state in this camp. And yet, this deeply asymmetrical process must be further understood as transactional. Farah, who you see here, was among the first refugees who participated in this initiative in 2007, in which the refugees were provided construction materials but required to perform all construction labor. But in return for her quote-unquote participation, Farah was trained in design and construction. Refugees in Ifo camp resisted this shelter initiative. They felt it demanded work beyond that of other shelter programs in which a shelter was just given. They felt it drained family resources, it exacted labor that might garner wages elsewhere, if illegal wages. Refugees were forbidden from subcontracting the construction. They had to do it themselves. They were discouraged from trading shelter materials that could provide higher value as commodities, on the in-camp market. The housing quality at the end of it all surpassed that elsewhere in the region. These exacerbated hostilities, but also aggravated tensions because these buildings started to express refugee permanence. Donors viewed the high unit costs as inappropriately luxurious, and they chafed as the beneficiaries in the refugee camps started to criticize the program's ideals and also the shelters themselves. But nevertheless, Farah found a utility in this aid package. She requested additional materials to build this small shop, and she could trade goods there. She would sell part of her family's ration and purchase things that she could sell in her shop. She had executed the project working from specifications that had been provided by the organization, and she also learned to direct a team of skilled and unskilled laborers. These included her spouse and her children, so she was actually training her own family in a set of skills. And perhaps through all this confounding the gender expectations that aid workers might have had of her. So in other words, she leveraged the broader work of homemaking into a form of economic and socio-political actualization. So the claim of political actualization, I know in this ambiguous situation, I believe it begs the question of how subjecthood and subjectivity form when the urgent domesticities of forced migration and emergency start to inscribe practices onto land, but are not necessarily coterminous with the nation state. Did Farah engage in petty capitalist practices or oppressive development practices? Or was something else at work? The refugee condition of contemporary Dadaab should be understood as bracketed within a long history of migratory living. Many of the camp's inhabitants come from communities that may be understood as pastoralist, but rather than frame these transhumant ways of life in opposition to settlement, it might be better to simply acknowledge the various material and aesthetic iterations of people who have migrated across this East African region, both documented and undocumented. For these communities, architectures of provisionality, like the one you see on the screen, have served as permanent architectures. The tent has not signified emergency or destitution, but has instead contoured and symbolized a direct habitation of the land for generations, and certainly within this recent century that we associate with modernity. Indeed, these ephemeral domestic architectures have offered a rejoinder to modernization in a sense because they exist in a context where the refugee settlement has been delinked from the land, delinked legally, figuratively, symbolically, and also practically. The refugee camp is not only conceptually, but also constitutively a fugitive architecture, a kind of an architecture of displacement. So, just to explain that a little bit more, this is a condition that's become legible through two mobile architectures, and they correspond to two analytical problems. The first consists of installed, imported structures, such as the UNHCR single-family shelter that you see here on the screen. The second is the large World Food Program food storage unit. Each of these is a tensile architecture with a fabric skin that is flat-packed, warehoused, and deployable from storage sites in the global supply chain. They conform to the political economies of actual states, but not to the land that the camp sits on. Analytically, this creates a territorial problem, a question of how architecture emerges in relation to a state economy that adheres to geopolitical boundaries, but also invokes the work of economic, territorial, and domestic planning. While the remit of planners certainly defined the spatial implementation of the Dadaab camps and all the humanitarian operations at Dadaab, the domestic space of the settlement complex actually responded to forces of unplanned growth. The Dadaab planners are not architects without a country, yet the refugee settlements correspond to no singular political or national identity. The second of these mobile architectures consists of a very different set of portable structures, the vernacular dwellings that are built from earth. They're built from plant materials. They're also built from rag-picked or recycled building elements. They don't map directly onto any national political economies, but instead they map directly onto the land. They may be plotted by planners, but then they're built in compounds that include live fencing and housing growing from the ground. So analytically, this is a problem of materiality, and it corresponds to politics related to the uses of the earth. In Dadaab, the risks ranging from hyena attacks to sexual violence for those transgressing the demarcated perimeter of the camps, for example, women who are collecting food or water or cooking fuel, demonstrates the hegemony of the horticultural border and its power to effect zoning. In an episode in which a group of mothers dug out the clay soil around the perimeter of the camps to make bricks for shelters, these large pits that remained filled with water during the rainy season turned into mosquito breeding grounds, which stirred up a public health crisis and tensions between a population of refugees who were cared for by foreign doctors and a population of citizens who were overseen by domestic healthcare workers. This brick production, also that you can kind of see some bricks in the background there, the brick production also caused a battle over trade and contracts that entangled local interests, local economic interests, and international refugee law and policy. In such scenarios, neither a refugee camp nor a nation state can be abstracted. The camp disallows land to be a referent for architecture. Architecture instead acts as its own referent. It is literally its own border, materializing the camp and the nation state, and producing forms of domesticity that disconnect the refugee camp from the territoriality and materiality of the land. The other central issue in this domesticity is that of labor, which is worth returning to in a final consideration of Farah's work. The architecture she made far exceeded requirements for shelter that would meet the most basic needs for survival that you would imagine in a refugee camp. The constructed form that she made was the result of a scientific process, quote unquote scientific. It offered a technical, professionally engineered solution for mitigating the extreme environmental challenges of the region. The design and implementation process produced evidence-based data that broadened the Norwegian Refugee Council's platform of technical expertise. This furthered the organization's social construction of expert status and cemented its own empirical knowledge base, while also building its international profile. They could use images like this to advertise themselves. Professional staff members disseminated findings from this very high-profile site of humanitarian operations when they went to conferences and in other networks that they were in. And this construction of institutional reputation drew from the physical and intellectual labor of refugees. Labor's multiple valences in this process, intellectual or manual, performed by refugee, citizen, or other, constitute the potency and the stakes of Farah's work. Predicated upon the labor induced by this process, architecture produced various forms of legitimacy. It cohered relief with a legible aesthetic regime, even a roofline that recalled Norwegian design in Somali, Kenya. It redirected material flows from the soil and cement of the brick walls to a non-governmental organization's laboring bodies. It signified actual states as well as the international refugee framework. It institutionalized Farah as an architect in charge of programming, design, construction, and use of a set of buildings, an expanded domestic space, and also an expanded role of homemaker. While formally certified architects, refugees, and unregistered others have been jointly responsible for the mass construction and architectural grain of the Dadaab settlements, Farah's architectural work, her homemaking writ large, rendered banal matters such as professional licensing. She engaged deeply with humanitarians and institutions in spite of an asymmetry between herself and the state. Farah, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and the UNHCR together ordered the sphere of sociality, of politics, and of differentiated aesthetic and cultural work. And if you take this as a sort of microcosm of the entire built environment, you start to understand the sort of fine grain of the labor and domesticity within it. These interventions interrupted the normative order of the nation state, and indeed Farah's liminal status as a refugee. They articulated questions of difference. Rather than the political sphere producing built forms of domesticity and architecture here effected a political subjectivity, rendering Farah as a subject of emergency as much as of any state or any international order. This emergency subjecthood, as well as her embodied practice of designing, building, and intersecting with a paternalistic and transnational political, economic, and social system, produced alternate forms of authority in the camp. They situated expertise, power, and mobility for her, and her emergency homemaking was a form of world-making. The question remains of how to understand this world, in which domesticity is rooted in emergency and provisionality is expressed in bricks and mortar. Taking these paradoxes in hand, I'll just return to Engels, because he might be helpful. When conventions of the state break down, archives do as well. In capturing the violated landscapes, mill towns, and slums that Engels famously sketched in The Condition of the Working Class in England, long before the tumultuous events of the housing question. And I think worth considering here in the landscape of Bombay, Engels offered a historical method. His thick description of the built environments of Manchester suggests possibilities for ways of knowing Dadaab, and I would liken his thick verbal descriptions to some of the thick, let's say, visual descriptions that you all offered us yesterday. His was a rhetoric of direct contact and commitment to an aesthetic, immersive, and embodied engagement in a sensorium, in an urban sensorium. His method forged a politics for the resulting histories to be written, which may be understood as separate even from those of himself as a writer, a very privileged, imperialist, Eurocentric, masculinist writer, and one who sometimes had a racist perspective, particularly of the Irish poor. When Engels wrote the chapter, The Great Towns in the Condition of the Working Class in England, ethnography had yet to find its footing in colonial thought, and it would be 100 years before the democratizing practices of this participatory action research, social history, and oral history would produce a body of socio-spatial analyses as rich as the ones he conducted by walking his reader through the working class neighborhoods of London, Dublin, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and most graphically, Manchester. He says, quote, "As I had occasion to observe them personally during 20 months," naming his field, as Rupali has cautioned us about. If this 20 months served as a field deserving of critical skepticism, his trenchant, vigorous description of real places and a lament for a humanity robbed through forms of spatial violence, as he talks about in this quote on the screen, anticipated the abstracted modern subject of contemporary forced displacement. Yet the illumination of this subject, precisely through a narration of built environments, speaks to the power of a method which might bring Dadaab into the historical stream alongside Manchester. In the book Speaking of Buildings, Janina Gosse situates the politics of historical method, its potential to restore absences and silences in the historical record, to expand historical writing and enable new forms of it, to reinstate difference and establish polyphonic narratives, and to negotiate with the unspoken and the unspeakable. I'd like to leave us with a related thought on method, that approaching homemaking from the spatial and temporal rubric of emergency may offer a special polyphonic and expanded historiographic potential. The vantage point of emergency allows history of work done by designated bodies involved in structural forms of governance to be subjugated to those of individuals, families, and communities who co-construct domesticity. This strategy illuminates a history of emergency subjecthood revealed through the act and architecture of homemaking. It works against the reproduction of crisis and ahistoricity that claims of urgency disallow. In thinking through this episode, in which an emergency intervention ushered in the social transformation of a woman, a relief aid organization, and the surrounding institutional and built environments, it's possible to map the modern humanitarian project, which is so different from the social one, onto the transformation of a humanitarian homemaker into an emergency subject, to see how a politics of emergency paradoxically produces rooted architectures and reproduces emergency subjects as architects. These empirical objects and subjects, the border camp, the humanitarian aid organization, the shelter construction, the refugee subject, the refugee architect, work against received definitions of stability and emergency, of normativity and precariousness, all of which essentialize each. Instead, they articulate questions of difference through new architectural reference and new narrators of home and its making. Thank you.
Thanks, Anooradha, for that wonderful talk. It opens out several questions for me, and not questions. I mean, as I'm muddling to thinking through my own work, it provokes a set of questions to think through and build further. And what I'd like to do is that I would like to open out 3 provocations and hello? Is this better? Is this better? Yeah. I'd like to open out 3 provocations that I thought might be useful to think through and build this conversation further. So let me pose my first provocation. As you mentioned in the beginning of your talk, if the violation of home, imagined both at the scales of the dwelling or the state, describes the very essence of turbulence, then could the notion of the refugee be expanded to think comparatively through and draw together a wide range of bodies beyond the refugees that you are describing in your own case, in your own research? How could we open out the term refugee to draw in a wide range of bodies who are experiencing the emergency condition, as you call it. And I'm kind of drawn to two kinds of works at sea that have been happening. One is a couple of my colleagues have been involved in the neighborhood studies project, where they are documenting histories of several kinds of neighborhoods, where they are looking at neighborhoods that are made of transit camps, relocation sites through developmental projects, but also so-called slums where people have kind of migrated from different places, which also bear marks of forced dislocation of some kind or the other. They could be the agrarian crisis, the climate crisis, so on and so forth. And could we open out this term? That is my question. And I'm also kind of, as I say this, I'm also kind of thinking about Dilip's talk, whether the condition of the emergency would be an appropriate way to kind of frame this. How could you kind of build around this term? Because he kind of says in his kind of morning talk that if we think about the division between the line of land and water overtaking the land as a condition of crisis, then there is a problem in this. How could you kind of talk to these two terms?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think one of the things that has been, I again felt this very much in hearing some of the students present their work yesterday, but one of the things that has come to me again and again in this research is that these conditions that we take as normative, like the kind of the activities of the state or understanding government, are in fact continuously under negotiation. And so I think for me, the exercise of thinking through emergency, what I'm trying to offer up as thinking about emergency as a method, is a way to start to reframe what you see as the everyday. So everyday life becomes something that you start to understand as having an urgency in the same way that you would understand a refugee camp. That a refugee camp itself is not so exceptional, that it's actually, I think, as Ravi Kunde said this morning, the normal versus the formal. I mean, it really is normal in a very important sense. In that way, here, I think anywhere in India, people really do understand the very ordinary transformation of something like a camp into a nagar. I think that that's a part of this history that people have imbibed very well, and maybe not so much elsewhere, because there are important ways that significant cities here were built out of things that we would have called camps. They wouldn't necessarily even have called them camps at the time, because they were just the way that people were living. What I think is sort of, I won't say exceptional, but it's an unusual aspect of the humanitarian system, is that because of the technologies that are made available through urban planning and other kinds of spatial technologies, you can then make something like a camp that is the scale of a city very suddenly. So there's not this kind of gradual sense of a camp turning into a nagar over the course of a generation. It actually is happening in the course of a week. So that is what I think is slightly different and creates this problem of ahistoricity that we think of as, that we associate with something like a camp. Or you see this happening in Bangladesh now, on the border with Myanmar. But I think that if we start to imagine this as normative instead of something unusual to have to react to, then I think we start to think differently.
Thanks. That kind of brings me to my second thought, and as I was kind of seeing the way in which you were describing the way in which this developmental subject, as you called it, the woman building, engaging in the practice of homemaking, I was reminded of my first kind of engagement with my fieldwork in Ulhasnagar, the refugee camp that I'm kind of studying. And in each of my first conversations, one of the things that came up from each and every person that I talked to was a line: "We built this city, tell our story." And uh, and I was wondering what was being told to me when people were telling me, "We build the city, tell our story." So just to kind of give you a brief background of this place that I'm talking about, in 1947, around 1 lakh refugees came from Sindh, Pakistan, and were settled in Ulhasnagar refugee camp, uh, around 50, 60 kilometers on the outskirts of Bombay. Um, they were provided aid and shelter for some time. Uh, in the 60s and 70s, they first slowly started building their own enterprises around cloth, particularly denims. It was Levi's and Wrangler's denim that they were trying to make in their city and sell it under the brand Made in USA. And this Made in USA referred not to the United States of America, but Ulhasnagar Sindhi Association. Uh, so, so, and then in the 80s, a similar thing happened with confectionaries industry. What we know as five-star in India gets sold under the same packaging when you see it from a distance, but is sold as superstar. Um, Gems get sold as games. So there's several of these. So in the 80s, it was the confectionaries industry. In the 90s, it was furniture making and plastics, and then furniture making, plastics and electricals, and more recently electronics. It's kind of been a shift in that. In 2004, uh, in 2004, there was a high court judgment passed that around 80% of the built fabric of this city had to be demolished, and uh, around more than I mean at, in 2004, the population of this town, whose size was around 3 kilometers by 4 kilometers, would have been around 4,000 people, 400,000 people, and 80% of this demolition. Through kind of several political engagements, they kind of upturned this. But what I was being, as I started thinking about this, I thought what I was being told by some of these interlocutors of mine on the field was that, as you mentioned, that there is a creation of an abstract refugee subject. And I think that it kind of works analytically along four lines. On the one hand, the idea of the suffering body, to which humanitarian aid needs to be provided. But on the other hand, also as the dangerous body that needs to be segregated away from the city. And therefore, all the refugee camps in Bombay were located beyond the municipal boundary at that time in 1947. Because they were probably considered as bodies that could incite violence. Third thing that happens is uh, 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 the whole issue of compensation and the entitled body because they have lost something. The third kind of trope comes in. And the fourth one is that the state, while kind of thinking of them as entitled bodies, also thinks of them as idle bodies, saying that we may provide them some kind of skill building uh, capacities, develop some skills, economic skills for them to gain work, but they have to be shut down after some point in time, and that they have to become their own laboring bodies, kind of thing. And that creates the abstract notion of the refugee body. And I think I was being told that you write a story about our building of the city, that we build this city against these four axes. And I see some of the commonalities over here as you kind of tell the story of this gender-based subject in this over here. And so I was wondering around all the kind of range of, the development, so-called refugee conditions, if you have to think of, that it is, if we have to write a story or tell a story, these become our analytical kind of entry points into thinking about body, space, and architecture.
Wow, that was really good, actually. I don't know if, especially for the students, I don't know if you got everything your professor was just saying, but I think you actually hit it very nicely on the head. One of the things that, especially your kind of four categories of analysis that show the ways in which a body then is evacuated of its own embodiment, first of all, but also its own spirit and its own life. It's, this is one of the things I've been grappling with a lot because I've been working on this for many, many years. And as you can imagine, the literature on spaces like this is very conditioned by thinking about things like the framings of governmentality and beyond writings by Foucault, there was for a long time preoccupations on definitions by Carl Schmitt and Giorgio Agamben that, in my mind, really emphasize lack and also really evacuate the life at the center of a lot of these places. And in fact, act as though there isn't a life, but there's only an analytical object. So these framings, I've always been, my own strategy has been to really focus on the person at the core of the story, and not even just the person as an embodied, not as an anthropologist would think about, a person within their milieu, but actually just listening to people and listening to their narrations of what they're experiencing. I mean, I think I still interpret what I hear, but I very much spend time listening. And that's been the way that I've tried to get into all of this. That to my mind, I don't actually want to talk to someone unless they're willing to put their name on the story. I do oral histories rather than, I don't ever call myself an ethnographer, although I spend a lot of time with people. I actually just want to hear how people tell their histories. But I do think that there are limitations to this too, because there's a desire always to have a story, to even have a kind of tidy way to explain all this. But I do, even after all this time, find myself pushing against that project of analysis that I think is at the core of the applied social scientists or population management sciences that have been the ways in which the literature at least deals with places like this.
Yeah.
I don't know. Oh, you and I see eye to eye on this, but it would be very interesting to hear if anyone disagrees with us.
Okay. So on that note, I won't get into the third provocation because we do have very short time, Prasad. No, but my third, I'll just briefly, I'm not open it for a talk, but kind of pose it as a comment. And as I was kind of looking through your work last year, I was also in conversation with a student who was doing a thesis, and she presented her work yesterday on Colombo's civil war and housing neighborhoods. And she wanted to write local histories of those places. And what was very interesting was that she used those stories that she generated through conversations with people to take them back to the field and engage in storytelling sessions as a method of design engagement. And in that sense, I was wondering whether the writing of histories and what form they can take up, which can have a life beyond the book or the academic space in that sense, and how it could kind of engage with practice as architects kind of engage with it. And so she engaged with the telling of these reciting of these stories, telling of these stories to an audience, on the basis of which there was a conversation that generated around how can you kind of engage different kinds of people who had retracted from public space. And that became a basis for a program generation. And I mean, in our conversations, we've discussed this, that we don't see the architecture as a final product, the building that comes out as a final product, but it's again possibly generating a next set of conversations back in the field.
Yeah, I like
So,
that.
so what are the possible ways in which we can creatively engage in terms of the method?
I mean, I think we'll see some very concrete, when we hear from Susanna and Marina later, we'll see some very concrete iterations of those kinds of things. But I do think, I mean, I had been thinking with Engels just for this event. And I know that there's many critiques of Engels, so I don't want to get into all that. But I do find his narrations of Manchester deeply compelling as a method. The idea that you could just very thickly describe something that you see that you feel is an injustice or that you want to name as an injustice, but you do it by very thickly describing it. In the way that we saw some of your drawings yesterday that were, and I mean, I think John's drawings this morning, I mean, the way that we're seeing, you know, every little object that could be described through some sort of visual means, he was doing that as well. I feel like there's something in that can be thought of as a method. And it pushes against emergency and these kind of hegemonies of urgency.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. With that, I'll open up the floor for discussion with the audience. So we'll take a couple of questions at one time, and then probably you can respond. Yeah.
In this production of, I've heard your lecture last year, so it's really invigorating. Just, what is the element of the fictive? Because also in Ulhasnagar and your telling of the subject producing, there is almost drained out of the fictiveness of production of selves. Because I think one of the most productive relationship we build with each other is that fictive capacity. Like it is said of like Hussein or Bob Dylan, you don't know where they were born, and how many mothers they had. This capacity to, and in refugee camp, and at least our literature shows, there is a lot of fictive way in which people produce the idea of land itself or idea of relationship. The divinity is different matter. I'm just wondering, in your research, or does it affect the way architecture or habitation or even the domestic is constituted?
I mean, I don't think refugees are always, the whole category of a refugee is all about longing for some other place or having been displaced from some other place. So maybe I've also just assumed it and I didn't bother to say it. I think it's the water that one swims in if one is in a forced displacement setting. If I'm understanding your question correctly.
Just kind of a small vignette in terms of response. Yes, I've seen it kind of emerging in the context of engagement with land, fiction kind of created through paper, and claims created through fictitious claims created through paper, but also in kind of developing the range of livelihoods that have emerged. And they have kind of emerged in the kind of ways in which stories are told about certain kinds of objects and the relationship that they built with those objects. For instance, the Made in USA story about this brand emerged actually in Mumbai docks. And most of the Sindhi refugees came via the docks, via boat, and then were settled in Ulhasnagar. In the docks, they noticed often many times, and they also got to work in the docks. So many used to kind of travel every day from Ulhasnagar to the docks to work. And they noticed every night a range of denims that used to come and vanish away. Also, also things like perfumes and other things. And what was most important was this thing about made in USA, and that's where the fictitious story kind of how can we build this by ourselves, and how can we kind of uh, create a good that can be sold across the entire country to a range of other people who cannot afford it. That's the story kind that emerged.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also a little bit cautious about what would be fictive and what would be. I think there are multiple viewpoints. I think one person's imaginary is another person's reality. And I have tried to be very sensitive to hearing a lot of different stories. In this particular context in Kenya, this is part of a larger territory that for at least 200 years has been sort of politically contested and imagined as part of a greater Somalia. So people don't even imagine that they are, in fact, refugees. Many people think this is just their land. I mean, I don't know if I don't know what you were getting at with the question, but I don't know that. Yeah, I think that there are just multiple viewpoints to be considered. Some, like especially younger people who grew up there and have grown up in a context of statelessness, would have a very different viewpoint because they haven't had a nation state to which they were able to belong legally and structurally. So they have maybe imagined other things, like maybe imagined the third country for resettlement in the future. But I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about or if you're thinking of something else that is more aesthetic.
No, nation state itself is fictive,
Mm.
fictive charge.
Mm.
So refugee has to lift that fictive charge and also deny or being denied. In that context, how you produce your subject is somewhere negotiating this
Mm.
We'll take this next two questions over here. Can you pass the mic? One, can you introduce yourselves and so that it's useful for the audience? So
Sure,
two
sure.
questions here and then Prasad.
I'm Himanshu Burte. So Anuradha, a very simple kind of narrow scope question about method, even silly perhaps, but I think there's something, and it's a question coming out of my own method concerns, you might say, for my own work. So I'm fully with you in terms of thick description. I'm fully with you in terms of listening. Also in terms in relation to oral histories. Yeah, I do most of that myself. But I'm wondering how does thick description, if you model yourself on Engels, okay, how does it move from one's own direct engagement in a milieu, say over 20 months, when you take it to oral history, right? Because you're really, I know the mechanical ways of doing it, but I'm wondering if there are methodological concerns there, because you're constructing a story based on possibly fictive accounts, constructions again, and then how do you read the thickness into it? Is it a lot of it being your own fiction, kind of constructed out of other fictions? And how do you deal with that question, A? And then when you take that, as you must, and you will, into theory, right? That move, the next move, also raises some questions, right? Challenges.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of obviously like academic or scholarly answers to your question, and I think different disciplines will have different answers. But I think you're not asking that question. For me, maybe this has also been why I again don't think of myself as an ethnographer, but I have always drawn on having a background as an architect. And maybe because I have a sensitivity to spatial environments that I just have. And so I trust that I'm seeing a lot of things that maybe wouldn't be captured by someone else. Even if I'm not myself drawing, I have colleagues who have worked in environments like this and they spend a lot of time sketching, which I think is a lovely method, and it's a very direct translation of what an architect would do on site. That hasn't been the way I've worked, but I do think that there's something about having a sensitivity to the built environment, so that there's a sensitivity to design and use simultaneously that I think comes from being trained in this way. That I fall back on a lot. I think that's more of the answer you might be looking for than the disciplinary one, because we can parse like what is an ethnographic approach versus a oral historical, and how do you compare sources and blah blah blah. And there's a lot of technical work to be done there, but I think it's much more intuitive in that way. Like I think it's a much more creative approach. And that's actually what I saw yesterday too. Like there's a really, I think, Juan, with your work too, there's a really intuitive way of knowing what to see. And historians would see that as a teleological approach and would criticize that. But I think I really rely on it.
Thanks. Next question here. Yeah, I think we'll just take a bunch of questions. One's over here, Dilip and Prasad. Is there a question here? And yeah, you can start.
Yeah, I'm Pradnya Chauhan. I was quite curious about two facts. That one, that there was no school in that area, and the second point that you talked about was they're not allowed to work, or they're not allowed to earn any money. So that's completely out of what the stories that we heard about Ulhasnagar. I mean, the very fact that you are allowed to work and you are allowed to produce your own thing and you're independent and you're going to grow independent because you're educated. So all these things, they matter a lot. I mean, it's like somebody saying, no, you're not allowed to cook in your house. I'm going to provide you food. And that just completely kills the spirit.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of
Correct.
reconcile to that?
Should we take a couple of questions more and then respond? Yeah.
So my question, actually, the thing is, I kind of disagree with
Could
one
you
of the
introduce
points.
yourself?
Sorry, my name is Ariba Siddiqi and I'm a research student. So I actually had a point of disagreement. What was discussed right now was, that there is some sort of similarity between a refugee camp and a labor camp, or an immigrant workers housing or camp, that is seen in the cities. I mean, the living condition can look quite similar. The lifestyle can look quite similar, and these things. But if you look deeper, and what you'll see is that perhaps immigrant workers and labor camps that you see, it is a voluntary act that they want to have a better living, or they want to earn better, so they choose that kind of a living, or they come to terms with it. That, okay, if I have to earn, then this is the living condition that I have to be in. But in refugee, that is reverse. It's mostly like they can never come to terms with their living conditions because it's an involuntary act. I mean, I think they might call it a home, or the bill form may be the same, but the relation is very different to that bill form. The reason also being that I happen to visit Jordan as well, where there is this Palestine refugee area that is there in Jordan. It's one of the biggest Palestinian refugee space. So there, their living conditions is much better than what you've shown us on the slides. They live much better conditions, but they can never call it their home. They have some psychological impact is there. I think they call it like it's a violent act. What happens, what makes them the refugee. So the thing is, if you can also tell me if there's some psychological impact that happens when people become refugees, and then sort of that always a disconnect with the land that they start to live in, or that which I have seen, or which I have kind of come.
Dilip. Sorry.
I'm Lekha. I'm also an architect. Yeah, taking forward from what she was saying to know, understand the difference. When if we are talking about India, and if we are talking about India, if the architect of our constitution says that he has no home, I think there is a deep there is we need to investigate further what being a refugee means. And there is a difference, as she said, between camps as well. But right now, if you're saying that camps as normative, I mean, one of the statements that you made, it's deeply disturbing when you make such a statement. It's not a normative, and it shouldn't be. So I do not understand why you would want to base your statements base a hypothesis like that when in the country that we are living in, the citizens of this country are especially the ones considered as refugees because they are saying that they don't have a home, never had a home. So I think it's disturbing that you would make a statement like that, and I just wanted to point it out. It's not a question.
Can I respond to some of these?
Yeah,
Because
okay.
just I would like to. So thanks for pointing these things out, but I'll just say that I don't think I would say that a camp is normative. What I was trying to say is that thinking about emergency as not a special state of affairs, but as one that we are constantly negotiating, can be a very useful method in terms of thinking about architecture. I would absolutely agree with you that thinking about a camp as a state of normativity isn't even true. But I also wanted to address the question over here that I don't think, I also wouldn't say that a refugee camp is the same thing as a migrant labor camp. Is that I wouldn't even want to compare the place that I'm looking at to a place in Jordan or to a place in India, or I think that all of these sites are actually quite historically specific, and the spatial conditions that appear are historically specific. So I really wanted to be clear, but I don't know where this came up, that it might be somehow related. But I do think that we can learn lessons in each of these places that can apply to other places. And I do think the lessons of, your question in a way is connected to these questions about the right to work and all these things, because I agree that in some ways refugees here and in Pakistan have been constitutive of the citizenry in a very different way than they have been in other places. And in Kenya, for one example, but there are many examples like this. When they adopted the refugee law, they took exception to these two sets of rights: the right to work and the right to higher education. Which is also not to say that people don't work and people don't get educated. They also do. These are just the kind of legal definitions of how people are formed structurally within the state. But those things then do come into play in terms of who can live where, who can actually, if you can become a refugee, in some contexts, you can live in an environment that has access to aid and has access to things that the quote unquote normative environment doesn't have. So those are the kind of specificities that I think would be very important to point out. But that's also why I think, especially in thinking about homemaking and domesticity and particularly issues that arise from considerations of gender, emergency can be a useful, a kind of a useful condition to contemplate, because I think that the kind of constant negotiation is also something that we find across these different kinds of environments. And if we start there as a place from which to think, I think it sets up a different, Himanshu, or you were asking about theory or how these things turn to theory, and that's where I think it does. Because it allows for a different kind of thinking when we don't assume that maybe that we don't assume that a state is functioning properly, or that whatever the thing is, we just don't assume a normative state, and we don't assume that emergency is itself non-normative. I think that can be useful.
Thank you very much, Anooradha. With this, I'll draw this panel to a close. We won't take a break, or we won't take a tea break right now because we are running late. We will start the next session immediately. So I just request all of you to kind of bear with this because we're short of time today. Yeah, thank you. With that, I'll invite Anuj to. Sorry, Dushan.